21 nautical miles. That is all that separates the Persian Gulf from open ocean at the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz. 21 miles of water, and through it flows nearly a fifth of everything the world burns for energy. For decades, this stretch of sea has been the single most dangerous choke point on Earth, not because of storms, not because of pirates, but because one country has always had the power to close it. That country is Iran. And for months, that threat has hung over the global economy like a blade suspended by a single thread. That thread has now snapped. Ships are turning back. Tankers are anchoring in open water, refusing to move. Oil has crossed $100 a barrel for the first time in years. And what's happening right now in the waters between Iran and Oman is not a temporary scare. It is the opening chapter of a global energy crisis that could reshape economies from Tokyo to Los Angeles. Today, we break down exactly how Iran lost control of the one weapon it always relied on, why that loss is more dangerous than the blockade itself, and what happens next to the price of everything you buy. Part on ye. Why Hormuz matters more than any other strait on earth. Before we go further, you need to understand why this narrow strip of water carries more geopolitical weight than almost any land border in the world. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf, home to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Iran, to the Gulf of Oman and, eventually, the open ocean. At its tightest point, it narrows to roughly 33 kilometers, with usable shipping lanes only a few kilometers wide in each direction. Every single day, in normal times, close to 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through this strait. That's nearly 1/5 of everything the entire planet consumes, moving through a gap of water narrow enough that a determined military can watch every ship that passes. And it isn't just oil. Roughly a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas, most of it from Qatar, also has no other way out. More than 80% of everything that leaves the Gulf through Hormuz is headed toward Asia. China, India, Japan, South Korea. These are economies that import the overwhelming majority of their energy, and almost none of it has a backup route. There are pipelines that bypass Hormuz entirely. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have built overland routes specifically to reduce their exposure. But those pipelines can only carry a fraction of what the strait handles by sea. If Hormuz closes, or even slows down significantly, there is no clean substitute. That is the entire reason Iran has treated this strait as its ultimate deterrent for 40 years. It doesn't need a navy that can defeat the United States. It only needs enough missile boats, mines, and drones to make every insurance company on Earth refuse to cover a tanker willing to risk the crossing. Part TWO. How we jot here. He war that nobody touched would last long. To understand why oil is spiking right now, you have to rewind to February 28th of this year, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran. The strikes were framed publicly as a decisive blow against Iran's nuclear program and military infrastructure, but what followed was not a short, contained operation. It became a war that has now stretched for nearly 5 months. Iran's supreme leader was killed in the early days of the campaign, a moment that many analysts believed would either force Tehran into total capitulation or trigger a far more chaotic and unpredictable phase of the conflict. What actually happened was the second option. Instead of surrendering, Iran responded the way it always said it would. It turned its attention to the one piece of leverage the United States and its allies could not simply bomb away: the waterway that carries their oil to the outside world. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps began laying naval mines, boarding and seizing merchant vessels, and firing on tankers attempting to pass without what Tehran called authorization. Over the following months, the numbers tell the story on their own. More than a dozen merchant ships damaged, several abandoned by their crews, at least 2 vessels captured outright, and more than a dozen seafarers killed or missing. A tugboat was sunk. A port worker was killed in Bahrain. This wasn't posturing. It was a slow, grinding campaign to make the strait functionally unusable without ever having to declare a formal blockade. The United States, in turn, escalated its own presence, establishing a naval blockade of Iranian ports, launching an escort operation to try to shepherd commercial vessels through safely, and eventually helping stand up what's being called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, an attempt to coordinate international shipping through the chaos. But here's the critical thing to understand. None of this actually restored normal shipping. It simply turned a choke point that used to be commercially normal into a militarized corridor where every single transit is now a calculated risk. Part Thre, He, moment everything changed. JSEM moment 26. Which brings us to now. In the past 2 weeks, the situation has moved from dangerous but manageable to something closer to full collapse. Reporting from multiple shipping data providers shows vessel traffic through Hormuz falling sharply. Not gradually, but sharply. As a renewed wave of American strikes on Iranian territory has coincided with what amounts to a functioning blockade. Commercial vessels are now sitting anchored off ports in Oman, rather than attempting the crossing at all. Shipowners and major trading houses, the companies that move crude around the planet for a living, have begun suspending shipments through the strait entirely rather than risk their vessels and their crews. On top of that, the United States has intensified its own strikes, targeting Iranian command centers, missile sites, and, significantly, infrastructure like bridges, desalination plants, and power facilities inside Iran itself. Some analysts and human rights monitors have raised serious concerns that strikes on civilian infrastructure of this kind edge toward what international law would classify as war crimes, a debate that is likely to intensify the longer this campaign continues. Iran, for its part, has kept up near-daily attacks on American bases across Gulf countries and has continued targeting shipping it considers hostile. The result of all of this is that oil is no longer just reacting to headlines. It is pricing in a structural, ongoing disruption. Brent crude has pushed past $100 a barrel, a level that, only a year ago, would have been considered a worst-case scenario for the global economy. And unlike previous scares in this conflict, where prices spiked and then eased once tensions cooled, this time there is no obvious off-ramp in sight because the fighting itself shows no sign of stopping. Part Foyer, WHO actually PIASTHE price. Here is where this story stops being an abstract geopolitical chess match and starts hitting real economies. Remember that statistic from earlier. More than 80% of what moves through Hormuz is headed to Asia. That means the countries absorbing the sharpest pain right now are not necessarily the United States, which has become far less dependent on Gulf oil over the past decade thanks to its own shale production. It's China, India, Japan, and South Korea, economies that import the overwhelming majority of their energy and have comparatively few alternatives. China, in particular, finds itself in an uncomfortable position. Beijing has maintained a long, deep partnership with Tehran, providing dual-use technology, including missile components, and geospatial intelligence throughout this conflict, while publicly positioning itself as a neutral party pushing for diplomatic resolution. That's a difficult balancing act. China needs Iranian oil, and it needs the relationship with Tehran to keep flowing, but it also cannot afford a prolonged energy shock to its own economy, which is already dealing with slower growth and its own set of structural pressures. Then there's the ripple effect beyond Asia. Analysts are now warning about contagion risk extending into Latin American markets, where oil exporters are quietly gaining market share as buyers scramble for alternatives to Gulf crude. That might sound like good news for those producers, but it also means the global oil map is being redrawn in real time, in a way that could outlast this war by years. Once buyers build new supply relationships to root around a crisis, those relationships don't simply disappear when the crisis ends. And of course, there's the simplest, most direct impact: the price you pay at the pump, on your electricity bill, on the cost of shipping, the products that fill store shelves everywhere from Delhi to Detroit. Energy is the input cost behind almost everything in a modern economy. When oil crosses $100 a barrel and stays there, it doesn't just hurt drivers. It pushes up the cost of manufacturing, of food production, of the fertilizer that grows that food, and of the ships and trucks that move it all. This is how a war fought over a 21-mile strait between Iran and Oman ends up showing up in a grocery bill in a country thousands of miles away. Part 5, THE, Regional Power, Sift Nobody Eyes, Talking A-Boat. While most of the coverage of this crisis focuses on oil prices and military strikes, there's a quieter story unfolding underneath it. A story about who gains power in the Middle East while Iran is consumed by this war. As Iran's influence weakens under the weight of 5 months of continuous conflict, other regional players are moving to fill the vacuum. Turkey, in particular, has been steadily advancing its position, expanding its influence in areas where Iranian-backed forces used to dominate. Analysts tracking the region have specifically pointed to Turkey's rise as one of the most underappreciated consequences of this war. Not because Turkey is fighting Iran directly, but because a weakened Iran simply cannot project power the way it used to, and someone always fills that kind of vacuum. This matters because the entire structure of Middle Eastern alliances over the past 2 decades has been built around Iran's network of influence. Its relationships with armed groups and allied governments stretching from Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen. If that network is genuinely breaking down, we are not just watching an oil crisis. We are watching one of the foundational power structures of the modern Middle East come apart in real time, with consequences that will outlast whatever happens to the price of crude. Part SIX, tap nuc happens next. So where does this go from here? There are really 3 paths worth watching. The first is a negotiated de-escalation, talks between Iran and its neighbors, particularly Oman, which has already held direct discussions aimed at easing maritime passage through the strait. Oman has historically played the role of quiet mediator in this region, and there have been proposals floated for a post-war maritime protocol that would regulate ship movements going forward. If something like that takes hold, we could see a gradual, managed return of shipping traffic. Though managed is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because trust between the parties involved is close to zero right now. The second path is continued grinding escalation. More strikes, more attacks on shipping, a slow bleed that keeps oil elevated for months without a single dramatic breaking point. This is arguably the most likely scenario in the near term, because neither side currently has an incentive to fully back down. The United States has framed this as a campaign to permanently degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping. Iran has framed its actions as defensive sovereignty over its own waters. Those 2 positions are not easily reconciled. The third path is the one everyone fears most: a genuine, sustained closure of the strait, whether through mining, direct attacks, or simple insurance markets refusing to cover any vessel willing to make the crossing. If that happens, we are not talking about $100 oil anymore. We are talking about a genuine global energy shock on the scale of anything seen in the past 50 years, with inflation, shipping costs, and economic growth all taking a direct hit simultaneously across multiple continents. What makes this moment different from every previous Hormuz scare over the past 2 decades is simple. This time, the fighting isn't a brief flashpoint that cools off within days. It has now stretched across 5 months, with no clear resolution in sight, and the strait itself has gone from at risk to functionally disrupted. Whether you're watching this from an oil trading desk, a shipping company, or simply wondering why gas prices keep climbing, the truth is the same. This narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman is once again deciding how much the rest of the world pays to keep the lights on, and right now, nobody controls it completely. Not Iran, not the United States, not the tankers sitting anchored and waiting in the Gulf of Oman for someone to make the next move. If you want to understand where global power is really shifting, not through headlines, but through the actual mechanics of oil, shipping, and strategy, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is far from over.